The sun had barely risen over the marble courtyards of Versailles when the first sounds of movement began to stir through the endless corridors. The soft rustle of silk skirts, the gentle scrape of a servant's broom, the rhythmic clatter of wooden shoes on polished stone. You are there, in the faint morning light, watching as the great palace begins its slow, deliberate awakening. The air is thick already, not with perfume yet, but with the heavy scent of damp linen and wax polish, and the faint trace of last night's smoke that lingers in the high, gilded ceilings. Versailles at dawn was not a quiet place. Even its stillness hummed with ritual. The women of the French court, duchesses, ladies in waiting, and those simply fortunate enough to orbit near the queen, were rising from their beds in a routine that was less about waking up and more about performance. To live at Versailles in the 17th and 18th centuries was to live as part of an elaborate play in which one's appearance, behavior, and even scent carried deep political weight. The king's day would not officially begin until the lever du roi, the royal waking ceremony, but the queen's attendants had already begun their own quiet version hours before. Behind the walls of her apartments, the ritual of preparation unfolded with methodical slowness, a kind of sacred monotony that only the French court could elevate to an art form. First came the cleansing, not with water, for water was mistrusted, believed to carry disease and weakness, but with linen cloths, vinegar, and spirits. Bathing in the traditional sense was rare, even discouraged. Instead, a woman of Versailles began her morning by wiping her body with perfumed alcohols and tonics. A mixture of orange blossom water, rose essence, and diluted wine vinegar was the preferred combination for many. These were not refreshing baths, but symbolic ones. They erased the remnants of sleep and replaced them with the artificial purity of scent. Then, the ritual of the skin began. A servant would open a box of CA Rouge, the infamous white lead powder that had been used for generations to create the ideal complexion, pale, unblemished, and as smooth as porcelain. Its preparation was tedious. Vinegar was poured over thin sheets of lead, left to corrode for weeks, and then ground into a fine, toxic dust. Mixed with vinegar, the paste became the foundation for the aristocratic mask. When applied in the dim light of the royal chambers, it gave the illusion of perfection, an almost ghostly whiteness that concealed the smallpox scars, blemishes, and fatigue that so many courtiers carried beneath their skin. It was a dangerous ritual. Many of the women who painted their faces in lead and vermilion did so every day unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that it poisoned their bodies slowly over time. Their hair thinned, their teeth blackened, and their health declined, but beauty at Versailles was a matter of survival, not comfort. By 7 o'clock, the queen's attendants had begun arranging her hair. It was a monumental task that could last hours. The elaborate hairstyles of the court, puffs, fontaines, and têtes de la reine, required not just creativity but endurance. Hairpieces made from horsehair, human hair, and even wool were piled high, sometimes reaching over a foot above the head. They were powdered with fine flower dust, scented with iris root, and occasionally adorned with ornaments, miniature ships, feathers, or birds. To hold everything in place, beeswax and pomade were worked through every strand, creating a sticky, perfumed helmet that could last for days, even weeks. You might imagine the scene. The queen seated before her mirror, surrounded by her tireless attendants, as layers of powder drift through the air like mist. The scent was intoxicating, a mixture of starch lavender, and the faint tang of sweat from the women working around her. The mirrors reflected not just her image but her status, a woman so essential to the kingdom that even the act of combing her hair became a public duty. Yet for all its splendor, the courtly ritual was deeply uncomfortable. Beneath the mountain of powder and perfume, women suffered. The weight of their wigs caused chronic headaches, the lead makeup burned and blistered the skin. The corsets, made from whalebone and tightly laced, compressed ribs and restricted breathing. Even the perfume, that sweet armor against the stench of Versailles, came at a cost. The ingredients were strong, often caustic musk from deer glands, ambergris from the intestines of whales, and civet oil from the glands of African cats. Still, Versailles smelled divine, or rather divinely artificial. Every corridor was saturated with scent, every person a walking bouquet. The queen herself was said to favor violet and rosewater, while Madame de Pompadour preferred more complex blends of amber and orange blossom. The perfumes did not just mask odor, they defined rank. A lady of high birth might carry her own perfumer, while lesser nobles relied on diluted mixtures bought in the stalls of Paris. It was said that one could walk through the palace and know who had passed by the lingering fragrance in the air. Perfume was identity, politics, and seduction all at once. But what was all this effort really for? The women of Versailles were trapped in a performance of beauty that extended far beyond vanity. The court was an ecosystem of observation. Every gesture, every scent, every detail was scrutinized and discussed. To appear pale and delicate was to appear noble. To smell fresh and floral was to signify purity. Even fatigue, when displayed artfully, could be interpreted as a sign of refinement. Evidence of late night devotion to the king's entertainment or the queen's confidences. Behind the glamour, though, there was fear of aging, of scandal, of being replaced. At Versailles, favor was as fragile as a glass perfume bottle, and reputation, once cracked, could never be repaired. So the women continued their rituals. Powder upon powder, layer upon layer, scent upon scent. They ate little, for food was an enemy of the corset. They smiled carefully, for lead paint cracked easily. They endured headaches, itching, and even mild fevers from their cosmetics, because to look ill was better than to look natural. Outside, in the royal gardens, the fountains gushed endlessly, fueled by machines that often broke and required hundreds of men to maintain. Inside, the palace glowed with candlelight even at noon, as thousands of mirrors reflected a world more illusion than truth. And you might wonder, standing there in the midst of it all, how anyone could live like this, how anyone could breathe beneath the layers of artifice. But for the women of Versailles, it was not a question of choice. The palace demanded beauty, and beauty demanded suffering. The very act of existing at Versailles was an exercise in discipline, a quiet endurance disguised as elegance. As the morning turned into midday, the rituals of dressing gave way to rituals of appearance. The queen and her ladies took their places in salons, corridors, and gardens, performing the elaborate ballet of conversation and observation that defined the French court. Every glance, every word, every smile was measured. Even the most mundane topics, a new shade of ribbon, the quality of the season's powder, carried political weight. To fall silent was dangerous, to speak carelessly ruinous. Yet in the faint tremor of their voices and the dull ache of their corseted bodies, one could sense the undercurrent of something else. A quiet longing, perhaps for air, for simplicity, for freedom from the tyranny of appearance. They would not have admitted it, of course. To question the rituals of Versailles was to question France itself. Still, one wonders what they thought when the candles were finally snuffed out, when the perfume had faded, when the mirrors reflected not their powdered perfection but the wary, human faces beneath. Did they ever dream of washing their faces with real water? Of stepping into the sun without paint, without scent, without pretense? Or did they fear what they might see if they did? The palace of Versailles, for all its magnificence, was a world of masks, and like all masks, it hid as much as it revealed. And as you drift through the hallways, the scent of powder still clinging faintly to the air, you might ask yourself, was it beauty they were chasing, or was it survival beneath the weight of their own reflection? By the time the bells of Versailles marked the hour of 10 in the morning, the palace had transformed. The quiet hum of early preparation had evolved into a steady, glittering rhythm, a living organism pulsing with movement, voices, and scent. The women of the court had completed their rituals of beauty, and now, powdered and perfumed, they stepped into the public stage of aristocratic life. You might imagine the scene, the hall of mirrors glowing with daylight, its long stretch of glass and gold reflecting 1,000 soft faces, each a masterpiece of artifice. The clicking of heels echoed softly along the marble floors, and conversations, whispers, laughter, gossip, wove together like a fine tapestry of sound. Versailles was not merely a residence, it was a theatre of hierarchy, and each woman who entered its halls played her part with careful precision. The order of precedence dictated every movement. The queen, of course, occupied the centre of this gilded world. Around her swirled a constellation of duchesses, countesses, and ladies in waiting, each vying for position. A closer seat, a longer glance, a kinder word. Even a moment's proximity to the queen could elevate one's standing in the court's endless social ladder. In this delicate choreography, appearance was everything. A misplaced curl, a smudge of rouge, or a gown slightly out of fashion could mean more than a broken promise. Each woman's attire was a silent declaration of rank and influence. Silk from Lyon, lace from Alençon, jewels from the Paris ateliers. Every element spoke to wealth and access. Yet beyond the shimmering surfaces lay an economy of exhaustion. To dress for court was not an act of pleasure, but of survival. A typical gown, the robe la franaise, could weigh over 20 pounds. Beneath its sweeping skirts lay petticoats, hoops, and stays, all laced tightly to create the perfect silhouette. The fabric rustled like waves when the wearer moved, but there was nothing effortless about it. Women often fainted from heat and constriction during summer gatherings. Servants stood by discreetly, ready to catch or revive them with vinegar, scented cloths. And always there was powder. It drifted through the air, settling in the folds of velvet curtains, coating the furniture, and forming pale ghosts on the mirrors. The hair powder, made from finely ground wheat or rice flour, was applied daily with bellows or brushes, filling the rooms with a soft, flowery haze. Sometimes, the scent of the powder mingled with the musk of perfume to form a fragrance both intoxicating and slightly sickly. Powder was more than vanity, it was a form of armor. Beneath it, women could hide fatigue, age, and even illness. Beneath it, they became timeless. And yet Versailles was a paradox. For all its obsession with appearances, it was also a place of decay, physical, moral, and architectural. The palace was enormous but poorly ventilated. The crowds, the animals, and the lack of plumbing made the air heavy with a constant undertone of filth. Perfume became less a luxury and more a necessity, the only barrier between elegance and the ever-present stench. Even the queen herself, first Marie Therese, then Marie Lescaut, and later, most famously, Marie Antoinette, was not exempt from this contradiction. She was expected to embody the perfection of France, yet she too suffered from the same discomforts. Her corsets pinched her ribs, her wigs itched, her makeup burned, and still, she smiled. At court, the art of suffering beautifully was a skill as essential as dancing or conversation. The women learned to move gracefully under the weight of their gowns, to endure hunger behind serene expressions, and to perform endless politeness while their heads throbbed from the perfume and powder. The afternoon was devoted to ritual appearances. In the Salon de la Paix, the queen might hold a small circle, receiving nobles and listening to petitions. In the Salon de Hercule, portraits of ancestors loomed over conversations that often drifted from politics to the latest scandal. A misplaced word could ruin reputations, while a compliment, delivered at the right moment, could secure a marriage or a favor. It was said that nothing in Versailles was accidental, not a word, not a glance, not a single movement. The women lived beneath the invisible gaze of the entire court, and their every decision was noted, whispered about, and remembered. In this environment, gossip was not idle entertainment, it was power. The saloneresses, the hostesses of conversation, shaped the mood of Versailles as surely as the king's decrees. A clever remark could raise an ally, a subtle insult could destroy one. Women who mastered the art of conversation held influence that no title alone could grant. But for every celebrated wit, there were dozens who faded quietly into the background, ladies whose lives became a monotonous cycle of dressing, waiting, and enduring. They smiled when required, curtsied when called upon, and returned to their small apartments at night to repeat the ritual again the next day. The endless repetition of these routines bred a peculiar kind of detachment. A life lived within the confines of etiquette, where spontaneity was nearly impossible. Even emotion had to be performed. Joy, grief, and even boredom followed a prescribed pattern learned through years of observation. Occasionally, a woman would rebel in small ways. A softer gown, a simpler hairstyle, or an unfashionable shade of rouge, each a quiet act of defiance. Marie Antoinette herself would later embrace simplicity in her private retreat at the Petit Trianon, exchanging towering wigs for straw hats and powdered gowns for muslin dresses. But even this simplicity became a performance, another costume in the endless masquerade of Versailles. You might imagine the fatigue, the physical and mental exhaustion of existing in a world that allowed no pause. Even rest was structured, even pleasure scheduled. The palace was designed to keep its residents always observed, always on display. Privacy was a luxury only the king truly possessed. In the quiet hours after sunset, when the great halls emptied and the candles burned low, the women of Versailles were left with themselves, and the lingering taste of powder on their lips. Some wrote letters, others whispered secrets to confidantes, and many simply sat in silence, unpinning their wigs and wiping the white paint from their faces. Beneath the layers of artifice, the truth of their lives revealed itself: loneliness, ambition, envy, fear. There are accounts from chambermaids and attendants, the silent witnesses of Versailles, that tell of women quietly weeping as they undressed. They spoke of hair falling out in handfuls, of skin marked with sores from the cosmetics, of sleepless nights haunted by anxiety. Yet the next morning, the rituals would begin again, as if nothing had happened. The palace demanded perfection, and yet there was something else that sustained them: a strange, unwavering belief in the importance of their roles. To live at Versailles was to live at the center of the world. Every small action, every ornament, every ritual was, in some way, a reflection of France itself. They endured not just for themselves, but for the illusion of greatness that Versailles represented. Outside the palace walls, France was changing. The price of bread was rising, the streets of Paris were growing restless, and the gulf between nobility and commoners widened with every passing year. But inside Versailles, time seemed to stand still, frozen in a haze of powder and perfume. It was a world of endless repetition, where days blended into one another, and beauty became both a duty and a disease. You might walk through the gardens now, centuries later, and still sense their presence. The ghosts of those women linger in the scent of roses and lavender that the wind carries through the air. The fountains still murmur the same soft rhythm, the same mechanical perfection that once echoed beneath their conversations. Their world is gone, yet not forgotten. Because Versailles, in the end, was more than a palace. It was an idea of beauty, order, and refinement so complete that it demanded everything from those who lived within it. And as the 18th century crept forward, that idea began to crack. The women who once defined the height of elegance would soon become symbols of excess. Their powdered faces, once admired, would be caricatured in pamphlets and posters. Their perfumes would become emblems of corruption. They did not know it yet, could not have known it. But the world that sustained them was quietly collapsing beneath their feet. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet corners of their chambers, a few of them felt it. That faint tremor beneath the polished marble, that whisper of change that no powder could cover, no perfume could disguise. It is almost midnight now in Versailles. The candles flicker, the mirrors dim. A lady removes her wig, revealing hair thinned by years of pomade and powder. She looks at her reflection, her pale face ghostly in the candlelight, and wonders, just for a moment, what she truly looks like beneath it all. Was she still beautiful? Was she still herself? Or had the mask become her only identity? Outside, the palace sleeps. But history as always moves quietly beneath the surface, preparing for its next act. And in that stillness, in that final breath before the dawn of revolution, one question lingers in the perfumed air. How long can a world survive when its beauty depends upon its own decay? The sun rises once more over the gilded rooftops of Versailles. It is the same light that has risen here for decades, soft, pale, filtered through the endless haze that lingers above the palace gardens. Yet this morning feels different, though the air smells the same of wax, of powder, of fading roses. You walk once more through the grand corridors, where the mirrors still gleam and the floors still echo beneath the click of heels. But there are fewer steps now. The crowds that once filled the hall of mirrors have thinned, their laughter and chatter replaced by a muted, uncertain quiet. The age of ritual is beginning to falter. It is the late 1770s, and though the women of Versailles continue their morning preparations as they always have, the outside world is beginning to intrude, not in sound or sight, but in rumor. The Queen's perfumer whispers of shortages. The servants murmur about debts. The price of flour has doubled in Paris. Yet within the walls of the palace, the rituals persist, stubbornly. At the Queen's toilette, the same familiar motions unfold: the perfumed cloths, the powder, the paint. Marie Antoinette sits serenely before her mirror as her attendants bustle about, fastening the ribbons of her gown and adjusting the curls of her powdered wig. She is young, barely in her 20s, yet already a veteran of performance. Each morning, her beauty is constructed before an audience, ladies of the court who watch in reverent silence as though attending a ceremony. It is, in truth, a ceremony, the toilette de la reine, a public act of private preparation. Here everything is symbolic. To offer the Queen her gloves is an honor. To hold the comb that touches her hair, a privilege. Even the act of handing her a handkerchief follows a strict hierarchy of rank. Marie Antoinette endures it all with practiced grace. She has inherited the rituals of centuries, the powdered weight of every queen before her. But unlike her predecessors, she does not love it. In her private letters, she calls the court prison made of mirrors. She dreams of simplicity, of air, of quiet, of escape from the suffocating pageantry that defines her every breath. It is this yearning that drives her to create her private haven, the Petit Trianon, a small retreat on the palace grounds where she can shed the layers of ceremony and play at pastoral life. Here, she becomes Antoinette, the shepherdess. She dresses in simple muslin gowns and straw hats. She walks barefoot through the grass. She fills the air with the scent of lilac rather than ambergris. But even simplicity becomes a spectacle. The court mocks her rustic games. Pamphleteers in Paris call her Madame d'Effacit and accuse her of decadence. They do not see her fatigue, her loneliness. They see only the powder, the jewels, the endless performance of beauty, and they resent it. For the women of Versailles, this resentment is a slow poison. The same perfumes that once symbolized refinement now symbolize excess. The same powder that signified nobility now represents waste. Even the air of the palace feels different, heavy not just with scent but with judgment. Still, the rituals go on. Morning leads to afternoon, afternoon to evening. The queen dines surrounded by courtiers who bow and flatter. The chandeliers drip light like honey, and the mirrors multiply every gesture into infinity. The orchestra plays the same melodies it has played for decades, and the dancers move in perfect rhythm, as though repetition itself might preserve the illusion of order. But beyond the gilded gates, France is starving. The women of Paris, their hands chapped and their bellies empty, speak in bitter tones of the powdered ladies. Bread riots spread like fire. The contrast between the painted faces of Versailles and the hunger of the streets becomes impossible to ignore. Inside the palace, however, life continues with mechanical regularity. A duchess adjusts her wig before attending the evening's gathering. She applies a final layer of powder, though the mixture burns faintly against her skin. Her maid coughs in the corner, a white dust cloud settling on her apron. The duchess notices frowns and calls for a fresh jar. In another chamber, a lady in waiting sighs as she tightens her corset. Her ribs ache. She glances toward the mirror and wonders, not for the first time, if beauty is worth this pain. But she cannot stop. None of them can. To abandon the ritual would be to abandon rank itself. The makeup, the perfume, the etiquette, all are parts of the same armor that protects them from the chaos beyond the palace walls. It is strange, perhaps, how deeply habit can hold a world together. For the women of Versailles, routine is safety. The rhythm of dressing, appearing, conversing, it sustains them. Even as rumors of unrest reach their ears, they cling to their powders and perfumes as though they could preserve not just their beauty, but time itself. And perhaps, in a way, they can. When we think of Versailles now, it is the image of these women that endures: pale faces framed in silk, eyes soft behind fans, rooms filled with scent and silence. They have become symbols of an era, fragile, elegant, doomed. But in their daily rituals, there was something more than vanity. There was devotion. They were caretakers of illusion, and illusion at Versailles was everything. The Queen's perfumer, Louis XIV, once wrote that scent was not mere pleasure, but an extension of the soul. His formulas for Marie Antoinette were carefully balanced: rose for tenderness, jasmine for power, orange blossom for purity. Each perfume was designed to express an ideal, not of the woman herself, but of the role she was forced to play. Perfume, powder, paint, each was a language of power, spoken fluently by the women of the court. To master it was to survive, to fail was to vanish into obscurity. Yet by the end of the 1780s, the language of power had changed. The people of France no longer admired the pale perfection of the court. They despised it. The revolution was coming, and with it, the slow unmasking of a world built on appearances. When the gates of Versailles were stormed in October 1789, the women who had once floated through its halls like powdered phantoms were forced to confront the raw air of reality. The perfumes could not mask the smell of sweat and fear. The wigs, heavy with flour, were stripped away. The paint washed off in the rain. Marie Antoinette herself, once the very embodiment of elegance, became the most hated woman in France. At her trial, witnesses described her former luxury with venom. The pearls, the gowns, the perfumes. They spoke of her as a symbol, not a person. Yet those same objects, the powders, the scents, had once been her only defense against a world that demanded she be flawless. When she was led to the guillotine in 1793, she wore no powder, no perfume. Her hair, once powdered white, had turned grey in the space of a few months. Her final face, bare and unpainted, was the face of truth, the end of a century-long performance. And yet, even after the fall of Versailles, the fascination with its rituals did not die. In the decades that followed, perfumers and chroniclers would recreate the scents of the old court. Museums would preserve the ivory combs, the tiny glass bottles, the lead, white powder boxes. Historians would study the routines of dressing and painting, not as frivolities, but as a reflection of the society that built them. Because in the stillness of those rituals, in the quiet monotony of the Queen's toilette, in the careful preparation of powder and pomade, lies the story of an entire civilization's obsession with control, with image, with order. The women of Versailles did not create that world. They inherited it. They maintained it. They suffered beneath it. And in their small daily acts, the lifting of a brush, the tying of a ribbon, the choice of a scent, they revealed the strange, fragile machinery of power that held France together until it broke. Perhaps, in the end, that is the true legacy of the powdered court, the illusion that beauty can preserve stability. As you walk once more through the empty chambers, centuries later, you can almost smell it still. The faint, sweet ghost of rose and amber lingering in the air. The mirrors are dull now, the gilding faded, the floors quiet. Yet if you listen closely, you can almost hear the whisper of silk, the faint laughter of women long gone. The air seems to hold their memory, a reminder that even in the most artificial of worlds there was humanity. They lived, they endured, they dreamed beneath layers of powder and perfume. And though history remembers them as symbols of excess, perhaps they were, in truth, something else entirely. Women surviving within a system that left them no other choice. Their rituals, boring, repetitive, suffocating, were also their rebellion. By maintaining perfection, they defied decay. By performing beauty, they resisted invisibility. And maybe that, more than anything else, is why we still remember them, not as villains of vanity, but as the quiet custodians of an age that believed in the power of appearance. When you leave Versailles, stepping into the open air, the scent fades at last, but the thought lingers. A final, slow reflection: was it truly vanity that built the powdered court, or was it fear of what might happen when the mask finally came off? The streets of Paris in the year 1745 smelled of many things: smoke from cooking fires, horse dung, unwashed linen, and the damp rot of the Seine. But somewhere above the chaos, drifting faintly through the salons of the aristocracy, there was another scent, soft, floral, deliberate. It was the scent of Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, the woman who would soon be known as Madame de Pompadour. To understand her rise, you must imagine her world. France under Louis XV was a nation of appearances, governed as much by beauty and intrigue as by politics or law. Versailles remained the center of this glittering system, its mirrored halls reflecting not truth but desire. The king was growing wary of politics, of ceremony, of his aging wife. And the courtiers whispered that he sought not another queen, but a companion who could soothe his melancholy. Enter Jeanne Antoinette. She was not born to nobility. Her father was a financier who fled France amid scandal, her mother, a woman of ambition. Determined that her daughter would rise higher than circumstance allowed, Jeanne Antoinette was educated in art, music, and manners, not merely to survive polite society, but to conquer it. By her early 20s, she had already caught the attention of Parisian salons for her intellect and beauty. But what made her unforgettable was her scent. She understood instinctively that perfume was more than adornment. It was identity, influence, and seduction. Where other women drowned themselves in overpowering musk or ambergris, she preferred something subtler, more personal: jasmine, rose, and iris, balanced to linger close to the skin. Her perfumes were not declarations but invitations, the kind that made one lean closer without realizing why. When she first appeared before the king, she did not need jewels or a crown. Her charm was quieter, deliberate, like the faint perfume that trailed her presence. It is said that Louis XV was captivated almost instantly. The court, always eager for a new diversion, called her la petite maîtresse du roi, the king's little mistress. But Jeanne Antoinette would not remain a curiosity for long. Within months, she was ennobled as the Marquise de Pompadour and installed in apartments at Versailles. Not merely a lover, but a force. From the beginning, she understood that survival at court required more than affection. The women who had come before her, fleeting favorites, each replaced as quickly as the king's whims changed, had failed because they treated Versailles as a stage for pleasure. Pompadour treated it as a chessboard. She studied everything: the routines of the courtiers, the alliances among ministers, the delicate balance between appearance and authority. She transformed her apartments into a sanctuary of culture and scent, rooms filled with flowers, books, and the faint perfume of violet and bergamot. Her mornings began quietly, with rituals as meticulous as any queen's. She would cleanse her face with rosewater and apply a thin layer of almond paste to soften her skin. Then came a touch of rouge, a dusting of powder, and the final, invisible layer, her signature perfume. This particular blend, made by her perfumer Pierre-François Lubin, became the essence of her identity. It mingled floral sweetness with earthy undertones, a reflection of her dual nature, delicate yet grounded, charming yet calculating. Wherever she went, the scent followed, as if she left traces of herself in the air. At Versailles, such subtleties mattered. Perfume was a form of politics. The king himself was known for his obsession with fragrance. His private chambers were filled with oils, sachets, and scented gloves. He demanded that each room of the palace carry a distinct aroma, changed weekly. The courtiers competed to please his senses. The perfumers of Paris grew rich on royal commissions. But Pompadour's mastery of scent was unmatched. She did not merely wear perfume, she used it to define spaces and moods. She had her bed linens washed in violet water, her letters perfumed with amber, her salons infused with rose oil. To enter her presence was to step into a world that smelled of calm, refinement, and control. And in that control lay her true power. For nearly 2 decades, Madame de Pompadour maintained her influence over the king. Long after their romantic relationship had ended, she became his confidante, his political advisor, even his art patron. She directed appointments, mediated disputes, and guided the tastes of an entire era. Her presence reshaped Versailles, gone were the vulgar excesses of earlier mistresses. In their place came order, elegance, and intellect. Pompadour championed porcelain from Sèvres, commissioned paintings from Boucher, and promoted French craftsmanship with relentless precision. The delicate pastels of Rococo art, the silks, the porcelain, the floral motifs, all bore her influence. But behind every aesthetic choice lay strategy. She understood that to survive, she needed to transform pleasure into purpose. She turned the king's indulgence into national culture, his whims into policy. Under her guidance, the arts flourished, not merely as decoration but as a form of soft power, a projection of French identity across Europe. Still, the court did not forgive her origins. Whispers followed her everywhere. She was called the commoner in silk, the perfumed usurper. The noblewomen who envied her grace mocked her behind fans, saying her beauty was painted and her refinement artificial. They were not entirely wrong. Her beauty was constructed, her refinement learned, but that was the very point. In a world obsessed with birthright, she made herself. And yet, even for her, the daily performance of perfection carried its toll. Her health, fragile since youth, began to decline. The lead powders that gave her complexion its pale brilliance ate slowly into her skin. The heavy perfumes, though exquisite, often triggered faintness. Letters from her physicians described chronic headaches, palpitations, and exhaustion. But Pompadour was relentless. She would not appear weak before the court. Each morning, even when ill, she summoned her attendants to prepare her toilette. The ritual was armor, the scent, the powder, the paint, each a layer of control against the chaos of illness and envy. You might imagine her there, seated before her mirror in a chamber of soft light, her reflection multiplied by glass and gilt. Her servants move silently around her, dabbing, combing, perfuming. She sits still, watching herself become Madame de Pompadour again. Not Jeanne, the wary woman beneath, but the Marquise, the legend. The transformation is slow, deliberate, and strangely tender, because beneath the performance lies a truth. She knows that everything she has, her title, her position, even her safety, depends on maintaining this illusion. The king may love her mind, but the court loves her image. To falter, even slightly, would invite ruin, so she continues. At night, when the courtiers have gone and the candles burn low, she removes the paint, the jewelry, the powder. Her skin is pale, her eyes shadowed. She writes in her diary, "To please is to reign. It is not a boast. It is a law, the one law that has ruled Versailles since its birth." As you drift through her perfumed rooms, centuries later, the scent still seems to linger faintly. Violet, rose, a touch of amber. The air feels calm, intelligent, disciplined. Pompadour's world was built on artifice, yet her intelligence made it real. Still, you might wonder, behind all the beauty and control, what did she feel? Did she ever grow tired of being perfect? Did she ever wish to smell simply of herself, without artifice, without the powder and perfume that made her who she was? Perhaps she did, but perhaps she understood something deeper, that in Versailles, identity was not born, it was crafted, and no one crafted it better than she did. Because while the king ruled France, Madame de Pompadour ruled Versailles, with powder, with perfume, and with the unshakable calm of a woman who knew that scent could be more powerful than a crown. When Jeanne, Antoinette Poisson, became Madame de Pompadour, the court of France transformed itself around her, though few would admit it aloud. She was not a queen, yet her influence ran through every corridor of Versailles, from the perfumed boudoirs of the nobility to the council chambers, where state affairs unfolded under chandeliers. But influence at Versailles was not a throne one could sit upon. It was a tightrope stretched between admiration and envy. For Pompadour, every day was a performance, not of passion, but of precision. To maintain power, she cultivated not only the king's favor but an entire ecosystem of aesthetics, etiquette, and subtle manipulation. Her allies were the perfumers, the designers, the artists, and the gossipers. She understood the rhythm of the court, when to speak, when to be silent, and when to let beauty speak for her. The art of staying seen. Pompadour's days followed a ritualized choreography. She woke early, long before the king, to prepare for what courtiers simply called la toilette, the act of becoming presentable to be seen by others. It was not vanity, it was survival. Her toilette was public. Courtiers of various ranks were permitted to attend, standing discreetly behind velvet ropes to watch the transformation. For them, it was a privilege. For her, a demonstration of power disguised as intimacy. The chamber would already be softly scented when she entered, jasmine, orange blossom, and powdered iris suspended in the air. Servants moved with practiced precision. One brushed her hair 100 times, another laid out silks chosen the night before, while her perfumer, Louis XIV, stood ready with crystal flakons of custom blends. Every scent had a purpose. Lavender to soothe, rose to charm, ambergris to dignify. The layering was deliberate, never too bold, never too faint, designed to leave the faintest trace of presence long after she departed a room. Perfume, in this sense, was not only olfactory, it was psychological. Courtiers began to associate certain scents with her authority. When others wore similar notes, the association was immediate. Pompadour, power, refinement. Her mastery of these subtleties made her more than a mistress. It made her an institution. The politics of porcelain. Pompadour's influence reached beyond fragrance and into the economic and artistic fabric of France. One of her greatest legacies was the transformation of the small porcelain manufactory at Vincennes into the world famous Versailles. At first glance, it seemed a trivial indulgence, another courtly hobby, but Pompadour saw something more profound. Porcelain was the perfect embodiment of her philosophy, delicate yet durable, ornamental yet political. She personally supervised designs, color palettes, and patterns. The now iconic Pompadour pink, a soft rose tone with a hint of warmth, became synonymous with her taste. It appeared on tea services, vases, and tableware gifted to visiting dignitaries. These objects did not merely decorate Versailles, they exported France's refinement across Europe. Kings and queens from Prussia to Russia clamored for pieces from Versailles, and in doing so, they paid tribute to the culture Pompadour had carefully curated. Louis XV himself understood little of art or commerce, but he trusted Pompadour's taste implicitly. When the royal treasury strained under military expenses, she convinced him to fund the arts regardless. "It pleases France to appear beautiful," she reportedly said, "and beauty pays in ways that numbers cannot show." Her calculation proved correct. The prestige of French craftsmanship strengthened the monarchy's soft power, even as its armies faltered abroad. And yet, behind the brilliance of her cultural achievements, whispers continued to gather. The whispering court Versailles was a living organism, perfumed, perfidious, and perpetually hungry for gossip. Every smile concealed a rivalry, every compliment hid an insult. Pompadour's greatest challenge was not the king's waning affection, but the courtier's endless malice. The noblewomen, bound by blood but divided by ambition, despised her for her bourgeois birth. They called her la bourgeoise parfumée, the perfumed commoner. Pamphlets circulated in Paris mocking her as a manipulative enchantress, her perfumes laced with witchcraft, her beauty a deception. She read some of them, and then, with characteristic calm, she did what few others at Versailles could. She ignored them. Instead, she deepened her alliance with the king not through passion but through intellect. When Louis XV grew disillusioned with politics, she kept him entertained with conversation and companionship. They discussed philosophy, architecture, and the latest works of Voltaire, whom she personally protected when the church condemned his writings. It was Pompadour who convinced the king to fund the Encyclopédie of Diderot and D'Alembert, a revolutionary project cataloguing all human knowledge. She, the woman dismissed as a mere mistress, helped nurture the intellectual movement that would one day inspire the Enlightenment. The decline of fragrance, but influence, like perfume, fades with time. By the 1750s, Pompadour's health was deteriorating. Chronic migraines plagued her, and her skin, damaged by lead-based cosmetics, began to show the quiet cruelty of age. The king, though loyal, sought physical comfort elsewhere, discreetly indulging in younger mistresses housed in secret apartments at Versailles. Yet Pompadour did not falter. She accepted the end of their romance with grace and reinvented herself once more, as the king's friend, confidante, and political partner. Still, she knew what she had lost. The air around her, once charged with the invisible electricity of seduction, grew still. Her perfumes became softer, less floral, more grounded, sandalwood, cedar, and amber. It was as if she were preparing herself for something inevitable. She spent her evenings alone more often now, reading or painting miniature portraits. Her once bustling salons, filled with laughter and music, became quieter. Servants noted that she lingered by the fire, eyes unfocused, listening to the echo of her own footsteps in the vast halls of Versailles. Even the king noticed her absence when she was not there. "Pompadour," he once said, "has the gift of never being in the way and never being absent." Still, the world outside the palace was changing. The people of France, wary of war and taxation, began to murmur discontent. Bread grew scarce, taxes rose, and pamphlets mocking the royal court multiplied. To the public, Pompadour symbolized the extravagance they despised. The powdered faces, the painted furniture, the perfumed air of a world that seemed blind to suffering. She read of riots in Paris and dismissed them with a sigh. "The people love their king," she said. "They simply forget why." But deep down, she must have known the truth, that the perfume of Versailles could no longer mask the stench of unrest. The machinery behind the mirror, behind every courtly gesture, every dinner, every gift of porcelain or lace, there was machinery. Endless, invisible, exhausting. Pompadour managed the king's moods, the minister's ambitions, the church's suspicions, and the army's failures. She scheduled audiences, read reports, and wrote letters in secret cipher. The king, who disliked paperwork, delegated much of his correspondence to her. She became a silent administrator, shaping decisions while allowing Louis XV to appear detached. At night, when her attendants withdrew, she sat alone at her escritoire surrounded by scented candles. Her letters still survive, hundreds of them, written in a precise, elegant hand. They reveal a woman who saw everything: the court's cruelty, the king's weaknesses, the futility of trying to make beauty permanent. One line appears often: tout passe, tout casse, tout lasse. Everything passes, everything breaks, everything wearies. It was her quiet philosophy, spoken without bitterness, the wisdom of someone who had built her life out of fragility and fragrance. The illusion of eternity. Pompadour's presence at Versailles changed how women were perceived at court. She proved that intellect and taste could rival lineage and inheritance. Her mastery of presentation, the art of being perfectly composed even when everything beneath trembled, became the template for aristocratic femininity for decades. But in doing so, she also made herself indispensable to a system that demanded perfection. When the king's ministers urged him to dismiss her, calling her influence unseemly, Louis XV simply replied, "She is necessary to me." And so she remained. Yet, the perfume that once symbolized her vitality became, in time, her mask. The scent that had announced her presence now lingered to conceal her fatigue. Sometimes the courtiers noticed it before she entered. A faint floral trace that seemed almost melancholy. The same fragrance, unchanged for years, now carried a different meaning. Fragrance, after all, is bound to time. It cannot remain fresh forever. The shadows gather in her final years. Pompadour retreated more and more to her private residence at Versailles, the Petite Curie, near the king's apartments. There she surrounded herself with books, porcelain, and carefully arranged bouquets of lilac and tuberose. Outside her windows, the garden stretched endlessly, symmetrical, eternal, and silent. She watched the seasons change from her chaise longue, sometimes sketching flowers, sometimes reading letters from Voltaire or Montesquieu. Her body grew frail, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to receive visitors dressed in soft pastel gowns and powdered wigs, every gesture measured, every word precise. It is said that one afternoon, as she sat before her mirror applying a touch of violet water to her temples, she looked at her reflection and murmured, "I shall die with all the perfumes of Arabia upon me." It was not vanity, it was understanding. She knew that her beauty had always been both her creation and her cage, and as her health declined, so too did her strength to maintain the performance. As her scent began to fade from the air of Versailles, the courtiers whispered again, not about her rise, but about her inevitable fall. Would she, they wondered, leave behind only the faint trace of perfume and porcelain, or something more enduring, an invisible influence woven into the culture of France itself? The answer, as with all things at Versailles, would depend on how well she managed the illusion of eternity in her final act. The year was 1764, and Versailles still glittered under chandeliers that never dimmed. But somewhere behind the golden doors and perfumed air, the most powerful woman in France was dying. Madame de Pompadour, once the brightest ornament of Louis XV's court, now lay pale and exhausted in her private apartments. The same hands that had once orchestrated the rhythm of the monarchy trembled when she tried to lift a cup of broth. The illness, what her physicians called a pulmonary congestion, though we would now name it tuberculosis, had hollowed her lungs and sapped her vitality, yet, even in decline, she remained composed. Each morning, her attendants continued their quiet ritual. They washed her face with rosewater, applied a thin veil of powder to her cheeks, and dabbed a drop of perfume at her wrists. Her signature scent, violet and amber, softened with orris root, still lingered faintly, though she could no longer bear strong fragrance. The king visited her daily, as he had for years. Their conversations had grown shorter, more subdued. He spoke of hunting, of the weather, of the endless boredom that accompanied rule. She listened, smiled faintly, and said little. But her eyes, grey and intelligent, still carried that steady composure that had once charmed an entire court. Outside her chambers, Versailles went on as if nothing had changed. The courtiers dressed, dined, and whispered as usual. The orchestra played in the Hall of Mirrors. The perfumers still delivered fresh sachets and pomades. But those who passed near her apartments noticed something different. The air was heavier, quieter, as though the palace itself sensed the approach of an ending. The last performance for nearly 20 years, Pompadour had been the axis upon which the court revolved. She had shaped everything, the colors of porcelain, the fashions of gowns, the tone of conversation, even the way the king's ministers conducted themselves. Her refinement had become the standard by which all others were measured. But now, even she could not refine death. She asked her attendants to keep her rooms in perfect order, her flowers fresh, her papers stacked neatly on her escritoire. There must be no disorder, she said, not even at the end, and so the days passed in quiet dignity. Her physician, Dr. Quesnay, visited often, though he could offer little comfort beyond polite reassurances. She did not fear death, only disorder, the loss of grace. The king, ever uncomfortable with illness, would sit beside her bed for a few minutes, speaking softly. He would compliment her on her endurance, remark upon her beautiful courage. She would smile and reply, "Courage is simply the art of waiting without complaint." When he left, he always kissed her hand, the same hand that had once guided France's destiny through 1,000 silent gestures. At night, she wrote letters she knew she would never send. One was addressed to Voltaire, thanking him for his friendship. Another to the director of the Sèvres manufactory, urging him to continue improving the glaze on porcelain, to make it as luminous as reason itself. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained fixed on beauty and order. The funeral that was too beautiful. On April 15, 1764, Madame de Pompadour died. The king was not with her. He had visited earlier that morning, promising to return after the rain had stopped. When the news reached him that she had passed, he looked briefly toward the window and said, "The Marquise will not see the spring." At Versailles, the announcement was met with a silence that lasted only minutes before the usual murmuring resumed. Death, after all, was not an interruption here. It was simply another ceremony. Her body was prepared according to her wishes. She had asked that her coffin be lined with cedar and wrapped in linen scented with violet water. The priests performed their rituals, the courtiers donned black silk, and the carriages lined up to follow her funeral procession through the rain-soaked streets of Versailles. Louis XV, standing at the window, watched the hearse depart. The rain dripped steadily from the eaves, and for a moment the king seemed moved. "She was a good friend," he murmured. "She was the only one who understood me." Then, as the hearse disappeared, he turned away. Versailles, unfeeling as ever, resumed its endless conversation. The echo of her influence, but Pompadour's scent, her true legacy, did not vanish with her. It lingered invisibly in every corner of the palace. Her porcelain still gleamed in the salons, pink and delicate. Her tapestries still hung from the walls, depicting pastoral scenes of serenity. Her architectural commissions, from the Petit Trianon to the Place de la Concorde, continued to define the aesthetic of a nation. Even her perfumes lived on. The perfumers she patronized, Lubin, Fargen and others, continued to craft fragrances inspired by her blends. The recipes, passed from apprentice to apprentice, found their way into later centuries. One, called Violette de Pompadour, survived into the 19th century and was still sold in Parisian boutiques long after her name had faded from memory. But perhaps her greatest legacy was less tangible. Pompadour had turned beauty itself into a form of governance. She had demonstrated that power could be exercised through taste, that culture could be a weapon as potent as armies. Under her, refinement became a political language, one that spoke of grace, control, and national identity. France, long after her death, would continue to define itself through that language, even during the Revolution. When the monarchy fell and Versailles was abandoned, the aesthetic she helped create remained synonymous with French sophistication. The ghost in the mirror, they say that in the decades after her death, servants at Versailles sometimes claimed to smell faint perfume in the empty corridors near her old apartments, a trace of violet and amber lingering in rooms long untouched. Some said it was merely imagination, others swore it was real. The palace, after all, was full of ghosts, though not of the restless kind. These were ghosts of presence, of repetition. Every mirror, every corridor had absorbed centuries of gestures, laughter, and whispers. If you stand in those rooms today, you might feel it. The quiet hum of preservation, the memory of elegance. Pompadour would not have wanted pity or mourning. She would have wanted to be remembered as composed, intelligent, necessaried, and in that she succeeded. Even in death, she maintained control of her image. The king ordered her belongings catalogued with care. Her library alone contained over 3,000 volumes, poetry, philosophy, science, art. Her papers, filled with neat annotations in her own hand, were sealed in boxes marked private. The courtiers quickly moved on to new intrigues. But the king never replaced her. In the remaining decade of his reign, he took many companions, but none who dared to speak to him as she had. None who softened his temper or corrected his indifference. When he died years later, he left behind a France teetering on the edge of collapse. The perfumed age of Pompadour had been beautiful, but it had also been fragile, a world of surfaces, sustained by grace and illusion. The fragrance of memory in the centuries that followed, historians debated her importance. Some dismissed her as a manipulative courtesan, a symbol of decadence. Others praised her as a patron of the Enlightenment, a pioneer of modern taste. But those who study her closely find something subtler, a woman who understood the paradox of her world better than anyone else. She knew that beauty, in a decaying system, was both consolation and disguise. She used art, perfume, and culture not to distract from decay, but to hold it at bay, to give meaning to a world already losing faith in itself. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Not because she ruled or conquered, but because she mastered the art of remaining composed when everything around her was falling apart. A fragrance without end. Imagine, if you will, walking once more through the Hall of Mirrors. The light falls softly across the marble floors. The air is still, yet faintly sweet. Somewhere, in the blend of polished dust and centuries-old wood, there is the ghost of violet and amber. That, they say, is all that remains of Madame de Pompadour. But perhaps that is enough. Her legacy was never meant to be loud. It was meant to linger quietly, like perfume, unseen, intangible, and impossible to erase. And so, her story closes not with triumph or tragedy, but with stillness, the stillness of a woman who understood that grace could outlast power, and that sometimes the softest things, a scent, a gesture, a color, can leave the deepest imprint on history. She once wrote in her diary, "I have lived for beauty, and beauty is a form of truth." Perhaps that truth remains suspended somewhere in the air of Versailles, in the spaces where mirrors meet light, and history whispers through silence. The fragrance fades, the palace sleeps, and with it, the memory of Madame de Pompadour settles, calm, perfumed, eternal. The year was 1679, and Paris stank of fear. The fountains of Versailles still ran, the salons still glittered, and the king's mistresses still powdered their faces with crushed pearls. But behind the guilt and gossip, a shadow crept through France. It came in small glass vials and folded packets of powder, sold quietly by women who promised miraculous love, fortune, or freedom from inconvenient husbands. They called it la poudre de succession, the inheritance powder. Others simply called it poison. It was the age of Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the monarchy appeared unshakable. The king ruled with divine right, surrounded by rituals that made him seem almost immortal. But in the homes and bedrooms of Parisian nobility, death was being brewed in teacups and perfume bottles. The women of Versailles, bored, restrained, and desperate, had found their own form of power. The seeds of suspicion, it began, as most scandals do, with whispers. A few sudden deaths among the nobility, a husband here, a rival there. At first, they were explained away by illness or misfortune. But the pattern was too precise: men dying after dining at home, wives widowed conveniently, inheritances passing neatly into eager hands. Rumors spread of fortune, tellers and midwives who could provide not only potions but solutions. ways to remove obstacles that law and custom forbade women to confront. And at the center of this subterranean network stood a figure both feared and sought after, Catherine de Monvoisin, known to history as La Voisin. She was a midwife, healer, and, in secret, a poisoner to the powerful. Her home in the Rue de Beauregard was a place of contradiction, herbs hanging from beams beside rosaries, perfumes beside phials of arsenic. She received noblewomen by appointment, often late at night, veiled and trembling. Her clientele included some of the highest ladies of the realm, duchesses, marquises, and most shockingly, the king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan. Madame de Montespan, the queen of scandal at the height of her power, Françoise Athénée de Rochechouart de Mortemart, the Marquise de Montespan, was untouchable. She was the official mistress of Louis XIV, mother to several of his children, and the center of every courtly ritual. Her apartments were filled with rare perfumes, exotic birds, and silks that shimmered like sunlight. But Versailles was a cage gilded in envy. The king's eye wandered, and younger rivals whispered behind their fans. For a woman whose identity depended entirely on favor, even a glance lost was a catastrophe. And so, when she heard of La Voisin, a woman who could restore affection with charms and powders, she listened. At first, it was harmless enough: love potions, perfumes infused with aphrodisiacs, small rituals whispered over candles. The king for a time seemed renewed in his devotion. But Montespan's ambition was insatiable. Soon she demanded stronger assurances, guarantees of dominance, not affection. La Voisin obliged. What followed was a descent into superstition and sin so strange that even centuries later, it feels almost unreal. The Black Mass, in a small chapel on the outskirts of Paris, under the dim light of candles, a priest-turned-renegade, Abbé Tungeberg, presided over what came to be known as the Black Mass. Witnesses later described it in horrified detail: a makeshift altar, a chalice filled with wine and blood, prayers recited backward. The most shocking element was the presence of a living altar, a woman, often naked, upon whom the rites were performed. La Voisin arranged these ceremonies for clients who desired the impossible favor, fortune, or love beyond reason. And one of those clients, according to several testimonies, was Madame de Montespan. She allegedly stood beside the priest, holding candles as invocations were spoken for the king's undying love. Some claimed that her name was written on parchment and offered to infernal powers. Others whispered that infants were sacrificed to seal the spell. It is impossible to know the truth, but the accusation alone was enough to shake France. The investigation, the scandal erupted when a minor nobleman, poisoned by his wife, confessed the source of her powders before dying. The police traced the supply back through apothecaries and fortune tellers until they reached La Voisin. In 1679, she was arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille. Under interrogation, she revealed the vastness of her clientele. Hundreds of names, many from the highest circles of power. The king ordered a special tribunal, the Chamber Ardent, to investigate. It became one of the strangest trials in French history. The accused were questioned in dark chambers illuminated only by torches. Testimonies were recorded in secret. Rumors spread that the king himself was mentioned in the confessions, that Montespan's name appeared again and again. Louis XIV, terrified of scandal, ordered parts of the testimony suppressed. La Voisin was executed in 1680, burned publicly in the Place de Gravy. But her ashes did not settle the matter, they only deepened the mystery. More arrests followed. Servants, priests, perfumers, and nobles alike were dragged into the inquiry. The court grew anxious, whispering behind fans that any bouquet might conceal death, any perfume might hide poison. Poison in the air. By the early 1680s, the hysteria had reached its height. Women no longer accepted sweets or drinks at gatherings. Perfume bottles were opened cautiously, and cosmetics, once symbols of elegance, became objects of suspicion. The line between beauty and danger had blurred entirely. The same powders that whitened a lady's face might also whiten her conscience. The king eventually ordered the tribunal dissolved, the records sealed, and the affair forgotten. But Versailles never truly recovered from the whisper of poison. The court had seen what lay beneath its own perfection: fear, jealousy, and the silent war waged behind painted smiles. And though La Voisin was gone, the women she had served remained. Montespan, disgraced, was quietly removed from the king's side and replaced by a younger, quieter rival, Madame de Maintenon, who soothed the king's conscience with piety rather than perfume. Montespan spent her later years in withdrawal, tending to charities and convents. Her once magnificent beauty faded, but some said that even in her prayers, she still smelled faintly of burnt incense and myrrh, the scent of rituals best forgotten. The Poisoner's legacy, the affair of the poisons, was not just a scandal. It was a mirror held up to Versailles itself. It revealed the desperation of women who lived in luxury but lacked control, who turned to powders and poisons because reason and justice were denied them. And beneath the horror, there was something quietly human: the longing to be loved, the fear of being forgotten, the helplessness of being beautiful but powerless. In that sense, the affair was not only a crime but a confession of an entire society addicted to illusion. As you drift through the mirrored halls of Versailles in your mind, imagine the whispers that once filled them, not of politics or art but of powder, perfume and poison. The air itself was a weapon then. And yet one must wonder, when every scent could kill, what did it mean to smell beautiful? By the spring of 1680, Paris had become a city of suspicion. The fountains still trickled in the squares, and carriages still rattled over cobblestones. But beneath the powdered wigs and polite smiles lay an unease that no fan could hide. At Versailles, the ladies of the court began to move more carefully, watching who poured their drinks, who touched their gloves, and who prepared their cosmetics. What had begun as rumor had curdled into fear. The affair of the poisons had revealed not only the presence of murder among the nobility, but the terrifying fact that it could be committed by anyone, especially by those least suspected, the women. The trade in secrets. The French capital had always been a marketplace of curiosities. Apothecaries sold tinctures beside perfumers, astrologers shared alleys with wig makers and glove sellers. But during the height of the poison scare, these trades overlapped in dangerous ways. At the heart of this mixture stood the perfumers of Paris, whose craft blurred the line between art and alchemy. The perfumer's workbench was a miniature world-glass vials of civet, musk, ambergris, and rosewater. They distilled from the petals of the Trianon gardens and mixed them with animal essences brought from distant colonies. Perfume was no mere indulgence, it was identity, a signature. To smell of jasmine or violet was to proclaim one's refinement. But perfume had a darker twin. The same skill that could extract fragrance from a flower could just as easily extract death from a mineral. Many perfumers and apothecaries shared recipes and tools, and when a lady came asking for a love potion, they rarely inquired too closely into her intentions. It was said that in the Rue Saint-Honoré, one could buy anything, from a scent to make a lover swoon, to a powder that made a husband never wake again. Lavoisin's circle depended on this network. Her associates, women like Marguerite Monvoisin, her daughter, and Marie Bosse, a fortune teller with a loose tongue, gathered ingredients from perfumers and alchemists under the guise of innocent cosmetics. Arsenic could be ground into face powder. Mercury could be disguised as skin cream. One contemporary chronicler, the police lieutenant Nicolas de la Reynie, noted bitterly, "The women of quality are so accustomed to deceit that they will risk damnation to keep a man's affection. They poison with the same hands that offer roses." The king's uneasy silence. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, had built Versailles as a theatre of control, a palace where ritual replaced freedom, where every bow, every glance, every scent served his glory. But the affair of the poisons was the one drama he could not choreograph. At first, the king ordered a full investigation, convinced that the matter would expose a few petty criminals. He appointed La Reynie to lead the tribunal known as the Chamber Ardent. Literally, the burning court, named for the torches that lit its sessions deep within the arsenal of Paris. But as the interrogations progressed, the names grew more dangerous. Nobles, courtiers, even clergy appeared in the testimonies. When the name of Madame de Montespan, his former mistress and mother to 7 of his children, surfaced in multiple confessions, the king's resolve began to crack. Some of Lavoisin's accomplices claimed to have seen Montespan at black masses, to have prepared potions for her use, to have carried her love charms inscribed with demonic invocations. Louis ordered all such testimonies suppressed. He declared that no evidence against Montespan was to be publicly recorded, but the whispers spread anyway. At court, her enemies smiled too sweetly, her friends avoided her eyes. Montespan herself grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that her servants were betraying her. That Maintenon, the pious widow who now advised the king, was her secret accuser. The Sun King's radiant world dimmed. For the first time, Louis looked around Versailles and saw not harmony, but decay beneath the gold. The women who knew too much. Most of those arrested in the affair were women, not nobles, but tradeswomen, healers and widows. They lived in cramped houses, often doubling as fortune-telling salons where incense masked the odor of poverty. For them, poison was not wickedness but currency, a way to survive in a society that gave them few choices. Among them was Marguerite Joly, an apothecary's assistant who confessed to selling powders for love and for release. Another, Catherine Trinan, was a fortune teller who claimed to brew remedies for the heart, though she admitted under torture that her remedies had caused several deaths. They were part of what one historian later called the female underworld of Paris, a shadow society of midwives, herbalists, and mystics who filled the gaps left by doctors, priests, and husbands. Their work was both feared and sought after. A woman who could mix herbs could also mix poisons. A woman who could deliver life could also deliver death. In a world that worshipped control, these women were uncontrollable. The poison files in his meticulous records, Loreni compiled thousands of pages of testimony, noting ingredients, prices, and clients. He discovered that poisons had their own taxonomy, each suited to a particular kind of revenge. Aquatofana, a clear, odorless liquid, killed slowly and without trace. Cantarella, rumored to come from Italy, brought swift, dramatic death. Arsenic powders were mixed with food or wine, mercury with beauty creams. Ground glass, crude but effective, was sometimes stirred into soup. But perhaps the most chilling detail was not the poisons themselves, but the casualness with which they were discussed. In one testimony, a noblewoman reportedly said, "A husband may beat his wife, take her fortune, or shame her name, but she may not lift a hand in her defense, unless she has a clever friend in the Rue de Beauregard." For Loreni, it was a revelation. The affair was not just about murder, it was about rebellion, the hidden revolt of women against a system that offered no justice except through crime. The shadow of Montespan. By late 1680, Montespan's position was untenable. She was not formally accused. The king would not allow it. But the knowledge that her name was spoken in the same breath as poison and black mass made her untouchable. Her daily life became a silent humiliation. Servants avoided touching her belongings, courtiers made excuses to skip her salons. Even her children, legitimized by royal decree, were kept at a discreet distance. In the privacy of her chambers, she grew restless. She burned letters, dismissed maids, and spent long hours in prayer. Yet those who attended her said she never lost her vanity. She continued to powder her face, to dab her wrists with orange blossom perfume, to arrange her hair just so. Perhaps, they thought, it was habit, or perhaps it was her armor, the only power left to her. When the king finally withdrew his favor entirely and turned to Madame de Maintenon, Montespan did not protest. She simply said, it was bound to happen. And yet, years later, when her name was whispered again, this time by her former maid, who repeated tales of poisons and rituals, Montespan was seen clutching her rosary so tightly that her fingers bled. The burning court's end by 1682. The Chamber Ardente had condemned 36 people to death, including Lavoisin and several priests. Others were imprisoned for life or exiled. But as the number of accused grew, the king grew wary. The more they investigated, the more the scandal seemed to climb toward the throne itself. Louis ordered the court closed, its archives sealed, and the remaining prisoners quietly forgotten. Some languished in cells for decades, their names erased from official records. The police burned many of the testimonies, but Loreni secretly preserved a few copies, notes of recipes, letters, and confessions. He would later write that the poisoners revealed more of the human heart than all the priests and philosophers of France. Versailles returned to its glittering routine. The fountains flowed again, the operas resumed, and the courtiers returned to gossiping about fashion rather than death. But the perfume of fear lingered, faint, like the trace of musk on silk long after the wearer has gone. The quiet aftermath, the affair of the poisons, left no monuments, no battlefield, no grand decrees. It ended not with revolution but with silence, the kind that seeps into the walls and stays there. Women's hands were once again folded neatly in their laps. The apothecaries returned to their craft, the perfumers to their fragrant work. But the lesson of those years could not be forgotten. The women of Versailles had learned that knowledge was power, even forbidden knowledge. That a vial, a flower, a pinch of powder could make or unmake kings. And though the affair faded into history, its ghost remained in the rituals of the court. Every time a lady opened her perfume bottle, she did so with a small, private hesitation, a memory of those who had done the same and found death in beauty's disguise. Imagine it now, the flickering candles of Versailles, the endless mirrors, the sweet, heavy air of amber and musk. Somewhere, beyond the chatter of courtiers, the faint echo of a trial still lingers. Was it truly poison they feared, or the realization that beneath their silks and powders, even the grandest women were capable of anything? The affair of the poisons ended officially in 1682. But history, like perfume, does not vanish when you close the bottle. It lingers, faint, persistent, refusing to be forgotten. The flames that had devoured Lavoisin's body in the Place de Grève seemed to leave behind a shadow that settled over the French court for decades. It was invisible but unmistakable, a change in the air. The courtiers of Versailles learned to speak more softly, to smile more carefully, to breathe a little more shallowly when the king entered the room. The Sun King still ruled, radiant and commanding, but there was a new tension beneath the rituals of his daily life. Every gesture had become a performance of control, an assertion that the order of Versailles, so fragilely restored, would never again be disturbed by whispers of poison or prayer in the dark. The fading of Montespan Franois, Athénais Marquise de Montespan, once the dazzling centre of the king's universe, was now an exile in plain sight. She still lived in fine apartments at the palace, but her rooms had grown quieter. Visitors were fewer, the laughter that once spilled from her salons replaced by the faint rustle of rosary beads. Her beauty, though still striking, had stiffened, her smile more mask than expression. She had become a ghost of her own myth. The king, out of decency or guilt, never publicly condemned her, but he no longer visited her chambers. When they crossed paths during formal gatherings, he greeted her with perfect politeness and no warmth. It was said that Montespan tried to regain his favor with small gestures, carefully chosen perfumes, a gown of the color he once admired, even a new coiffure that reminded him of their youth. But Louis' gaze always passed her by. Versailles had a cruel rhythm. Once a woman lost the king's attention, she lost everything. Influence, friends, even servants drifted away. The same courtiers who had once flattered her now gathered around her rival, Madame de Maintenon, a woman of modest birth and careful virtue who had learned that power could be won not with beauty but with piety. Where Montespan had ruled through desire, Maintenon ruled through conscience. And so the palace shifted. The laughter faded, the candles burned longer, the court became devout, orderly, and dull. The silence of the survivors, the lesser figures of the affair, the midwives, the perfumers, the priests, disappeared into the oubliettes of French history. Some died in prison, nameless and unmarked. Others slipped quietly back into the city, their trades ruined by association. The fortune tellers were driven underground. The apothecaries learned to label their jars more carefully. The perfumers, once careless with their secrets, became meticulous. Recipes that once flirted with danger were rewritten, and certain ingredients, arsenic, mercury, belladonna, vanished from inventories altogether. But even as the trade purified itself, the fascination remained. Poison, once the tool of desperate women, had become the obsession of chemists and scholars. In the academies of Paris, alchemists spoke of refinement, of transforming matter without moral taint. The same substances that had once killed could now, they claimed, heal. Arsenic became medicine, mercury a purifier. The same desire that had led Lavoisin to mix her powders now drove scientists to isolate their elements. The line between witchcraft and chemistry was thinning. It is a curious thing, how knowledge redeems itself. When practiced by poor women, it was superstition. When practiced by learned men, it was science. Versailles cleanses itself, Louis XIV, ever the master of appearances, understood that power depended on control, not of the body but of the imagination. To erase the memory of the poisons, he turned Versailles into a machine of beauty. New fountains were built, new gardens laid. Perfume returned to fashion, its moral associations scrubbed clean. Florists supplied the court with endless blooms, and perfumers developed new scents free of the heavy, animal notes that once dominated the king's court. The air of Versailles once again smelled of roses, violet, and orange blossom, the olfactory symbols of purity. The king himself commissioned the royal perfumer, Jane Fargen, to create fragrances that emphasized cleanliness and restraint. Gone were the intoxicating musks favored by Montespan. In their place came lighter, almost sterile compositions: lavender, lemon, verbena. Perfume had been reclaimed as virtue, and yet beneath this cleanliness was repression. Every rule of court etiquette, every ritual of dressing and dining, served as a kind of exorcism, a way to remind the nobility that order had triumphed over chaos, obedience over temptation. But order, when it becomes absolute, can be its own kind of suffocation. The record keeper, one man, however, could not forget: Nicolas de la Reynie, the chief of police who had overseen the entire investigation, kept a secret copy of the tribunal's files. He had seen too much to believe in the simple morality the court now projected. In his private notes, written in a careful, slanted hand, he recorded not just the crimes but the motives, The fears, the humiliations, the quiet despairs that had driven noblewomen to seek poison instead of prayer. They were not monsters, he wrote. They were prisoners who mistook freedom for sin, and sin for freedom. Reni retired from public life soon after the affair's closure. He lived quietly in his estate, surrounded by papers that no one else wished to read. He died in 1709, his manuscripts sealed by royal order, as though even his memory were an infection that needed to be contained. Those files would remain hidden for nearly 2 centuries, buried in the archives of the Bastille. When they were finally uncovered in the 19th century, scholars found them astonishingly detailed, lists of names, recipes, ingredients, and whispered confessions. Reading them today feels like opening a door into a room that was never meant to be entered. The moral alchemy. By the early 18th century, the scandal had faded into legend, half remembered, half denied. Versailles had new concerns: wars, debts, and the slow decline of a monarchy that had once seemed immortal. But the lessons of the poisons endured in subtler ways. Women at court still sought influence, but they had learned to wield it differently, through philanthropy, religious devotion, or the management of royal children. The days of alchemists and powders were gone, replaced by salons of reason and wit. Yet beneath the Enlightenment's clean light, something of the old darkness remained. The fascination with control, of nature, of the body, of love itself, did not disappear. It simply changed language. Where Lavoisier had mixed herbs, chemists now mixed compounds. Where Montespan had invoked spirits, philosophers invoked rationality. The hunger for mastery remained the same. It was in its way another kind of poison, slow, invisible, respectable. Montespan's final years. Montespan withdrew completely from court in 1691. She retired to a convent in Paris, where she lived for over 20 years in strict religious observance. Visitors who saw her there reported that she remained elegant, even in penitence. Her gowns were plain but perfectly tailored, her veils starched with care. She spent her fortune on orphanages and hospitals, as if to atone for every rumoured sin. Yet some said that she kept, hidden in her private chest, a small bottle of perfume, her favourite scent from the days of her reign, amber and rose. She never opened it, but she never discarded it either. When she died in 1707, the convent's nuns noticed a faint fragrance lingering in her room. They said it smelled neither holy nor profane, only human. Her body was buried without ceremony. The king, who once loved her passionately, did not attend her funeral. But in his private chapel, he is said to have bowed his head during the Mass that day longer than usual. The true inheritance, the affair of the poisons, left no heroes, no martyrs. It revealed a truth more mundane and therefore more terrifying, that beneath the rituals of civilization, every society has its poisons, and they are often of its own making. The women of Versailles were not villains. They were, in their way, chemists of survival. Denied the instruments of law or autonomy, they created their own forms of power. Their sin was not ambition but the form it was forced to take. When you look at Versailles now, its mirrors, its marble, its endless symmetry, it is easy to forget that those surfaces once reflected fear. But perhaps that is the palace's greatest illusion, that beauty, order, and control can ever completely banish the human chaos beneath. The same powders that once whitened a woman's face also carried her into history. The same perfumes that mask decay still float in the air of the Hall of Mirrors, faint but persistent. If you were to stand there late at night, when the tourists are gone and the lights dim, you might smell something. Not roses, not musk, but the ghost of a world that believed beauty could make one safe. History has a scent, and in Versailles, it is never entirely sweet. And perhaps the real question left behind by the women of the poison affair is not how they died or what they did, but what they were trying to escape. Was it love, loneliness, or simply the unbearable stillness of a life lived entirely for show? There was a particular silence that fell over the court at Versailles each morning. A kind of ritual hush, broken only by the soft clink of mirrors being set in place and the faint scratch of brushes against porcelain bowls. It was the sound of transformation. Before the day's audiences, before the music, before the elaborate dances and politics, there was always this private hour, when the women of the court, and often the men too, assembled their faces like masks, and in those masks lay a slow, glittering death. The ideal face to live at Versailles in the late 17th and 18th centuries was to perform perfection. Every gesture, every word, and every glance was curated for effect. The same was true for the face itself. Pale skin was the ultimate symbol of refinement, a sign of birth, leisure, and purity. To be tanned was to be common, to labour outdoors, to belong to the world of servants and peasants. And so the women of Versailles sought whiteness at any cost. They achieved it through ceruse, also known as Venetian white, a brilliant, chalky pigment made from white lead. The recipe was simple but deadly: lead plates suspended over vinegar until they corroded, then ground to a fine powder and mixed with vinegar, rosewater, or egg white. The result was a smooth, opaque cream that could erase blemishes, veins, and time itself. When applied in layers, it created the illusion of perfect, marble-like skin, a living statue glowing faintly beneath the candlelight. The irony, of course, was that the beauty it promised also destroyed the beauty it created. Lead did not stay on the surface. It sank into the pores, entered the blood, and poisoned the body slowly. Over time, it caused muscle weakness, insomnia, and a peculiar paleness that the fashion of the day mistook for elegance. Women would reapply ceruse to cover the very sickness it caused, creating an endless loop of concealment, both literal and moral. The palette of illusion: once the face was whitened to perfection, it needed contrast. Rouge for the cheeks, kohl for the lashes, and patches, small pieces of black silk or velvet, applied to strategic spots. Each mark had meaning: a patch near the mouth signified flirtation, at the corner of the eye, passion, on the forehead, dignity. They were called moches, flies, and were both decoration and language. The rouge itself was often made from vermilion, a pigment derived from mercury sulfide. It gave a warm, lively color that seemed to pulse beneath the cold white mask. The effect was exquisite under candlelight, the illusion of health, of blood beneath the skin. But like ceruse, vermilion was toxic. It caused trembling, headaches, and eventually madness. A woman might smile brightly through the evening, her cheeks glowing, while her body quietly absorbed the metal that would one day stop her heart. Still, no one complained. Beauty, like politics, demanded sacrifice. The morning ritual every morning at Versailles was an event, a choreography of attendance and vanity known as la toilette. For the queen, it was almost public theatre. Courtiers of various ranks attended her as she dressed, powdered, and applied her cosmetics. The privilege of handing her a handkerchief or brush was a coveted honor. Marie Antoinette, in her early years, was said to have enjoyed the ritual immensely. She surrounded herself with perfumers, hairdressers, and beauticians who transformed her daily. Her dresser, Madame Bertin, later known as la ministre des modes, supervised every detail: the blending of creams, the preparation of hair powder, the selection of ribbons and lace. On the tables of her dressing chamber stood glass jars filled with lead paste, tiny boxes of rouge, bottles of orange flower water, and trays of white powder that, when shaken into the air, formed a pale mist, like smoke from an unseen fire. It was beautiful, almost sacred, and yet each ingredient was slowly eroding her health. By her late 20s, observers noted that the queen's skin was increasingly fragile, her hair thinning, her hands prone to tremors. She blamed stress or sleeplessness or bad air. No one dared to tell her that it was the very powders of her crown that were undoing her. Powder as power: to powder oneself at Versailles was not merely vanity. It was politics. The more extravagant the hair, the whiter the face, the heavier the scent, the higher one's rank appeared. To be underpowdered was almost a social offense. Men too took part, their wigs dusted with clouds of white starch or rice flour, their cheeks touched with rouge, their hands perfumed with orange or amber essence. But for women, the art of face painting carried special significance. It was one of the few domains in which they held complete authority. Within the ritual of cosmetics, a lady could command her own transformation. She could appear older, younger, colder, or kinder at will. In a court where a misplaced glance could ruin a career, that kind of control was rare and precious. So even when rumors of illness and disfigurement began to circulate, stories of peeling skin, swollen tongues, and hair falling in handfuls, few women abandoned the fashion. Better to die beautiful than live plain. And besides, the symptoms came so gradually, so elegantly, that they hardly seemed real. The perfume of death scent, too, played its part in this quiet poisoning. Because the cosmetics of the time were made from animal fats, oils, and vinegars, their odor was often unpleasant. To mask it, perfumers created elaborate fragrances, mixtures of civet, ambergris, musk, and floral essences. These perfumes were strong, almost overwhelming, designed to compete with the smell of the body beneath layers of clothing and powder. But some of these ingredients were themselves dangerous. The alcohol used to extract fragrance could irritate the skin already weakened by lead. Certain musks caused dizziness or fainting. One physician of the time remarked that the women of Versailles carry in their scent both the sweetness of the rose and the corruption of the grave. Still, the court was addicted to perfume. Every room, every person, even the palace fountains were perfumed. The very air of Versailles became a mixture of decay and desire. To breathe there was to inhale the contradictions of the age. The price of perfection behind closed doors, the consequences were visible. Ladies complained of chronic fatigue, of blackened teeth, of trembling hands that could no longer hold a fan gracefully. Hairdressers noted clumps of hair left behind after styling. Physicians prescribed rest and wine. But these ailments were treated as the natural cost of refinement, signs that one belonged to the delicate world of nobility rather than the coarse life of laborers. The truth, of course, was simpler and crueler. The very ingredients that made them look alive were slowly killing them. Lead attacked the nervous system, causing lethargy and melancholia, hence the title some physicians gave the fashion la beauté thargique, the lethargic beauty. Mercury inflamed the gums and eroded the jaw. Arsenic, used occasionally to brighten the eyes, caused blindness. And yet the powders remained in vogue. When the chemists warned of danger, the courtiers laughed. If beauty kills, one duchess famously said, then it kills politely. A mirror of control, it is tempting to think of these women as vain, but that would be too simple. Their makeup was not merely decoration, it was armor. In a world where they could not inherit titles, hold office, or speak freely, their faces became their power. The mask was both shield and weapon, the only means of expressing what the language of politics denied them. Each layer of paint was an act of defiance against time, against visibility, against the narrowness of their existence. If it also happened to be an act of slow suicide, then perhaps that was the truest expression of life they could make. And so, each morning at Versailles began the same way, with a woman sitting before her mirror, dipping her fingers into a jar of white lead, and drawing her own disappearance onto her skin. As the sunlight touched the glass, she saw not herself, but the ideal she had been told to become. And somewhere, beneath the perfume and powder, her body whispered its quiet protest. But what happens when the mask begins to crack? When beauty itself turns against its wearer? When the illusion becomes impossible to sustain? That is where our next section begins. The mirror had always been a friend. It caught the light softly, flattered the skin, and offered a reflection that obeyed. But by the late 18th century, for many women of the French court, the mirror had become an enemy, a relentless witness to decline. At first, it was only small things as stiffness in the fingers, a dull ache in the jaw, a faint swelling under the eyes. But in a place like Versailles, where even imperfection could be scandal, these small betrayals felt catastrophic. And so they did what they had always done. They added more powder. The disguised disease, physicians of the time began to take notice. Lead poisoning was not yet fully understood, but its symptoms, pale skin, fatigue, trembling hands, were becoming impossible to ignore. The royal court physicians recorded a rising number of mysterious illnesses among women of rank: insomnia, paralysis, miscarriages, and what one doctor called melancholie de blancheur, the melancholy of whiteness. Some courtiers fainted regularly. Others suffered mood swings so severe they were described as possessed by humors of vanity. The strange part was how many of these symptoms were praised rather than pitied. A pale, trembling figure leaning gracefully against a gilded chair, that was beauty. A delicate cough was charming, a soft voice was feminine. The more fragile the appearance, the more refined the lady was thought to be. It was a culture that mistook illness for elegance. And because so many shared the same sickness, few could see it for what it was. The doctors and the deniers, a handful of medical men, tried to speak against the trend. In 1760, the Parisian chemist Michel Philippe Bouvard warned that the white face of fashion is but a mask of death. He wrote pamphlets explaining how lead penetrates to the marrow and corrupts the spirit. But his warnings were dismissed as hysteria. The fashion journals of the time accused him of attacking the dignity of ladies. Even some physicians were complicit. The royal apothecaries continued to prepare and sell ceruse and vermilion, often adding perfumes or floral waters to disguise their harsh odor. They called it poudre d'ange, angel powder. And who could resist the promise of an angelic face? A world built on surfaces, the danger of Versailles was not just chemical, it was psychological. The palace itself was a theatre of appearances, a world where the surface was more real than the self beneath it. Every bow, every smile, every gesture was calculated. Even emotions were rehearsed. To survive, there was to master illusion. In such a world, cosmetics were more than vanity, they were survival tools. A poorly powdered face could suggest negligence, illness, or disrespect. To appear without rouge was to risk invisibility. So, when a woman's health began to fail, she did not rest, she repainted. When her hair fell, she wore higher wigs. When her cheeks grew hollow, she layered on more vermilion. Each correction demanded another. The mask grew thicker, the body weaker. There were women who could no longer leave their chambers without assistance. Not because they were ill, but because they could no longer breathe properly through the layers of powder and perfume that covered them. Still, each morning they insisted on dressing, painting, and perfuming. To stop was to admit defeat. The powder room's powder was not only applied in private, it had its own social spaces, the salons poudre, or powder rooms, which were built into many aristocratic homes by the mid-1700s. These were elegant, white-dusted chambers with gilded mirrors and carved chairs. Servants entered wearing linen masks to avoid inhaling the powder clouds, which hung in the air like fog. The ladies would sit for hours, having their hair towers arranged, often several feet high, adorned with lace, feathers, and miniature ships. Each layer of the elaborate coiffure was dusted with starch or rice powder, sometimes mixed with ground plaster or even powdered bone. The air became thick and heavy. The powder settled on clothes, furniture, and lungs. Guests would cough politely through conversations, pretending not to notice, and yet these powdering sessions were a cornerstone of court life. Social events in themselves. Gossip, flirtation, and politics all happened amid the haze. To be seen, there was to be part of the spectacle. But by the end of the day, most participants went home with throbbing heads and faint stomachs. A few developed what the doctors call the mal de poudre, powder sickness, characterized by vertigo, blurred vision, and fainting spells. Still, the next morning the ritual began again. The decline of the Queen's complexion by the late 1780s, as France inched toward revolution, Marie Antoinette's appearance had become the subject of constant scrutiny. Pamphlets and caricatures described her as vain and decadent, painting her as a woman who cared more for her face than her country. The truth was more complex. In her private letters, the Queen often complained of fatigue, rashes, and headaches. Her attendants noted that she could not bear bright light, and that her hands sometimes trembled when writing. Doctors prescribed her calming tonics, mixtures of wine, laudanum, and honey, but never addressed the cause. They could not, or would not, suggest that the royal cosmetics themselves were poisoning her. Her makeup routine grew shorter in the final years, but not out of awareness. It was necessity. Her skin could no longer tolerate the lead creams she once favored. In their place came lighter powders, tinted with starch rather than lead. A faintly healthier choice, though it did little to restore what had been lost. When portraits of her from the early 1790s show a subdued, tired woman with soft eyes and less paint, they are often described as symbols of humility. But perhaps they were simply the result of exhaustion, from both poison and performance. The servants' exposure, it was not only the noblewomen who suffered. The servants who prepared and applied the cosmetics often bore the worst effects. Maids mixed the powders by hand, breathing in fine particles of lead and mercury day after day. Some developed constant coughing fits, others lost their hair entirely. The wig makers too were at risk. Their fingers cracked and bled from handling hair treated with lye, pomades, and powders. The perfumes they used to scent the wigs were so strong that many fainted while working. One anonymous valet wrote in his journal in 1784, "We are all dying of the dust that makes them beautiful." It was not an exaggeration. The palace was a web of invisible toxins. In the face creams, the air, even the clothing. The delicate lace collars were stiffened with starch mixed with arsenic to preserve their whiteness. The gloves were perfumed with mercury, based tinctures to keep moths away. To live in beauty was to live surrounded by death. The first cracks in the mask by the late 1780s, a new generation began to rebel, quietly at first through fashion. The Dula Grec style emerged, a simpler look inspired by ancient ideals, favoring natural skin tones and looser hair. Some women appeared at court with little or no rouge, shocking their peers. Writers and philosophers began to praise nature over artifice. Rousseau's ideas of purity and authenticity gained ground, even among the aristocracy. The powdered mask began to symbolize hypocrisy and corruption, the artificial face of an artificial society. Of course, the political radicals soon adopted the symbolism. As revolution loomed, the white-faced nobility became an easy target for mockery. The very powders that had once signified refinement now marked their wearers as relics of a dying world. But for the women who had lived their entire lives behind that mask, removing it was not liberation. It was loss. They had built their identities in the mirror. Without it, they no longer recognized themselves. The science of unmasking. After the Revolution, doctors and chemists began to publish papers on the effects of lead and mercury cosmetics. One report in 1799 described how women who used ceruse lost their teeth, their sight, and sometimes their reason. Another claimed that the desire to appear fairer has made fair widows of many husbands. The new French Republic, seeking to distance itself from aristocratic excess, outlawed certain cosmetic recipes. Lid-based products were banned in 1803, though enforcement remained weak. But by then, the damage had been done. Generations of noblewomen had carried the poison in their bones. Some survivors suffered lifelong nervous disorders. Others faded from history entirely, their names remembered only in the diaries of court gossip. It is said that when archaeologists later examined the remains of 18th century aristocrats, they found unusually high levels of lead in their bones, a silent trace of their devotion to beauty. The body, it seems, remembered what the mind had forgotten. The end of an era. When the Revolution came, the courtly arts of powder and paint vanished almost overnight. The guillotine, with its sharp finality, did not care for rouge. Simplicity became virtue. White faces, once admired, now provoked suspicion. And yet, even in the prisons, some women continued the old rituals, rubbing their cheeks to bring color before facing the crowd, adjusting their hair with trembling hands. It was habit, perhaps, or dignity, the last act of self-presentation before death. When the blade fell, it did so on faces that had spent a lifetime being shaped, painted, and perfected. A final, terrible symmetry. The powder had settled. The mirrors were empty. And yet the question lingered: was beauty the poison, or merely the mirror that reflected a poisoned world? When the gates of Versailles finally closed to the court in 1789, the palace fell silent. Its endless corridors, once filled with perfume and powdered breath, stood still. The mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors reflected nothing but dust and ghostly light. And yet, outside those golden walls, the world had not stopped craving beauty. It had only changed the manner of its pursuit. From court to counter in the years after the Revolution, Paris remade itself. The royal wigs and white faces vanished, replaced by modest dress and natural simplicity. But simplicity is never simple. The chemists of the early 19th century saw an opportunity to create new kinds of cosmetics, ones that promised beauty without visible artifice. Instead of chalky ceruse, they offered powders made from zinc oxide, rice, and talc. Instead of mercury rouge, they used carmine, extracted from crushed cochineal insects imported from Mexico. Advertisements in Parisian journals proclaimed the arrival of pure and healthy beauty. The word natural began to appear on product labels for the first time. Yet the irony was almost perfect. These new concoctions were not as safe as promised. Many were still laced with trace metals, perfumes, and alcohols. The addiction to perfection and to poison continued, merely in a more palatable form. The ghosts beneath the powder, the women who had survived Versailles, carried the habits of the court with them into exile or widowhood. In small Paris apartments, in rented rooms in Vienna or London, they kept their cosmetic boxes. The silver mirrors dulled, but they still sat before them, applying faint traces of white to their faces before attending modest dinners or church services. It was not vanity, it was memory. To appear without paint was to betray who they had been. Duchesses, ladies, queens in miniature. Even in the New Republic, where equality was the new ideal, they preserved a fragment of the old world each time they opened their powder boxes. But their bodies bore the quiet marks of what they had endured. Many of these exiled women suffered from tremors, blurred vision, or the wasting fatigue described by doctors as mal de plomb, Leeds sickness. One Maigret, writing from England in 1804, confessed in a letter to a friend, "I no longer paint my cheeks. They burn by themselves. I suppose the colour is my body's revenge." It was not an isolated confession. Science and the painted women. The 19th century saw the rise of chemistry as a respected science. Laboratories replaced alchemy. But even as scientists learned the composition of poisons, cosmetics continued to blend them into creams and powders. In 1820, a French chemist named Pierre Joseph Pelletier examined popular face paints and found measurable quantities of lead carbonate. He warned that prolonged use caused progressive paralysis of the face and mind. Still, the cosmetics sold well. For the first time, beauty was democratized. You no longer needed a royal title to wear powder, only a few coins. Shops along the Rue Saint-Honoré and the Palais Royal sold small jars of white cream, each promising to restore the bloom of youth. Middle-class women now painted themselves just as the duchesses once had. The tools of nobility had become tools of ordinary aspiration. The poisons of Versailles had simply gone public. the medicine of appearance. As the century progressed, medical journals began to document strange cases among young women working in fashion and cosmetics shops. They described trembling fingers, sallow complexions, and episodes of fainting. The same symptoms once whispered about in the Queen's chambers. Doctors gave the condition new names: satanism cosmetiques, cosmetic lead poisoning, and mal de coquetterie, the sickness of vanity. They wrote of women who painted their faces until their souls faded. Some physicians proposed moral explanations, suggesting that the illness was a punishment for pride. Others, more practical, urged the government to ban lead in cosmetics, but the bans were inconsistent. Each new formula replaced one poison with another. Lead became zinc. Arsenic replaced zinc. Bismuth replaced arsenic. The cycle continued. The ingredients changed, but the quiet hunger for transformation never did. Perfume and poison, reborn while powders evolved. Perfumes followed their own path, from animal musk and civet to alcohol-based fragrances. The new perfumes of the early 19th century were lighter, less cloying, and far safer, but some of the old recipes lingered, especially among those nostalgic for the court's sensual atmosphere. Perfumers who had once served Versailles, houses like Hubigant, Lubin, and Guerlain, adapted to the new age, advertising their scents as worthy of queens. Their earliest formulas still contained traces of ingredients like tincture of benzoin or ambergris, rare, intoxicating, and mildly toxic when inhaled in enclosed rooms. Thus, even in progress, there was peril. Every woman who dabbed a bit of eau de fleurs d'orange behind her ear was inhaling the ghost of Versailles, a sweetness that carried, deep within it, the memory of decay. The quiet return of the mask. By the mid-19th century, Paris had become the center of global fashion once again. Under Napoleon III, the Second Empire revived luxury, and cosmetics returned to open respectability. The Empress Eugenie, wife of Napoleon I, famously declared that a woman's face is her first duty. Her luminous complexion inspired a new wave of powders, rouges, and perfumes. And once again, lead returned. Despite earlier warnings, it reappeared in certain formulas under new names: Blanc de Pearl, Sublimate, Poudre Royale. Manufacturers claimed their products were refined and non-corrosive, but the composition was almost identical to the deadly ceruse of the 18th century. The doctors warned again. The chemists sighed. Society powdered on. It seemed that civilization could not abandon its addictions. It could only disguise them better. Legacy in the mirror today, when we look at portraits of those powdered women, the Duchesse de Polignac, Madame de Pompadour, or even Marie Antoinette herself, it is tempting to see them as distant curiosities, frozen in their white masks. But the reflection they left behind is closer than it seems. Modern cosmetics, though regulated, still echo the same paradox: beauty achieved through transformation, comfort found in illusion. The 20th century replaced lead with industrial chemistry, parabens, phthalates, synthetic pigments. Fewer poisons, perhaps, but the same old question remains: how much are we willing to sacrifice to appear unblemished? When you open a compact mirror, you repeat a gesture that began centuries ago in candlelight. The same slow motion of face meeting reflection, of person meeting performance. You may not smell vinegar or musk. You may not feel the weight of powder, but the ritual, the ancient contract between vanity and vulnerability, still lives in the modern act of looking. The women who vanished in the archives of the court, certain names disappear without explanation. Maids who served in the Queen's chambers, ladies in waiting who suddenly resigned their posts, noblewomen who retreated to the countryside complaining of fatigue. Their absences are unremarked upon in the official record, as if the palace simply absorbed them, but private letters tell a different story. Some describe lingering illnesses, skin that fell away like wax, an endless weakness that no prayer or physician could cure. They were erased not by scandal or treason, but by fashion, by a loyalty to appearance so complete that it became fatal. The silence of their deaths mirrors the quietness of their lives. They were not heroines, not villains, just women who believed what the world told them, that beauty was worth everything. And perhaps that is the most boring and most human tragedy of all. Dust to dust by the early 20th century, Versailles itself had become a museum, its rooms restored, its mirrors polished, its ghosts politely contained behind velvet ropes. Tourists walked through the same chambers where duchesses once powdered their faces, unaware that the faint discoloration on some of the painted ceilings came not from age, but from the very lead in the air that once filled the palace. The poisons had settled into the walls. Even history, it seemed, could not wash them away. Yet the palace endures, beautiful, brittle, eternal, a monument to the human desire to appear more than we are, and as the sunlight passes through its high windows, it catches the faintest particles of dust, swirling in the air like old powder, still rising, still falling, still refusing to rest. To look into a mirror is to see not just yourself, but everyone who ever stood before one. Every woman at Versailles brushing poison onto her cheeks, every chemist promising purity, every modern hand reaching for perfection. The reflection stares back, and for a moment you might wonder, have we ever truly washed the lead from our skin? Or do we still carry its shimmer, invisible but unforgotten, in the stories we tell about beauty? The air of Versailles was never clean, not from the day Louis XIV moved his court there in 1682 until the Revolution tore it apart a century later. Perfume hung in the corridors like a fog, floral musky, and faintly sour beneath the sweetness. Every breath carried layers of rose, orange blossom, ambergris, and sweat. To live in that palace was to breathe a mixture of decay and desire, disguised by the genius of perfumers. The age of scent by the late 17th century, France had become the perfume capital of Europe. It was not by accident. Louis XIV, the Sun King, suffered from an acute sensitivity to bad odors. His courtiers learned quickly that to be unscented was to be offensive. To be perfumed was to be civilized. He demanded that every chamber, glove, wig, fan, and handkerchief at court carry fragrance. Even the horses of Versailles were perfumed, their manes brushed with rosewater and their saddles rubbed with musk oil. The king himself changed scents with the seasons. In spring, he favored orange blossom, in winter, amber and clove. The royal perfumer's task was endless. The air itself became a political tool, scented according to the mood of the court. It was said that a perfumer's failure could cost him royal favor faster than a diplomat's misstep. The first perfumer of the king, the title Parfumeur du Roi, perfumer to the king, was among the most coveted appointments in France. One of the earliest and most famous holders of this position was John Fargen, who served both Louis XIV and later Madame de Montespan, the king's influential mistress. Fargen was more than a craftsman, he was an artist of chemistry, part of a guild that mixed medicine, beauty, and alchemy. His shop in Paris was lined with glass jars of herbs, resins, and exotic animal materials, musk from Tibet, ambergris from Wales, civet from African cats, and essence of rose from Provence. Each scent came with its own mythology and danger. Musk was said to inflame passion, ambergris calmed the nerves, civet deepened the scent of the skin. To mix them properly required balance. Too much musk, and the perfume became unbearable. Too much amber, and it lost its strength. Fargen was known for blending in secret proportions, keeping his recipes hidden even from his apprentices. When he sent a new perfume to the palace, it arrived sealed in wax and labeled only by number, not name. The problem of smell. Versailles was beautiful to look at, but dreadful to smell. Despite its fountains and gardens, the palace had almost no plumbing. Waste from hundreds of nobles, servants, and guests was dumped into nearby courtyards or carried away in buckets. The stench of the latrines drifted through open windows, mingling with the scent of rotting food and wax candles. Perfume became not a luxury, but a necessity. Women carried small pomanders, metal or ivory balls filled with scented herbs, to hold under their noses during audiences. Men soaked their gloves in scented alcohol to mask the odor of unwashed hands. Even the church chapels burned perfumed incense to disguise the air. The scent of Versailles was not merely aesthetic, it was survival, but it was also deception. The more the palace reeked of roses, the more it concealed the rot beneath its marble floors. The secret ingredient's perfume in the 18th century was both chemistry and sorcery. The main ingredients fell into three categories: floral essences, extracted from roses, jasmine, lavender, violet, and tuberose. Animalic notes, musk, civet, ambergris, castoreumi from beavers, all of which added depth and warmth. Fixatives and solvents, oils, fats, and alcohols used to hold the scent to the skin. Some recipes included bizarre additions: powdered pearls, crushed insects, and tinctures of snake root. Others used vinegar steeped in herbs, a disinfectant in disguise. The perfumer's workroom smelled like both a garden and an apothecary. Behind every bottle lay an experiment, a danger, or a secret. Lead and mercury sometimes appeared even here, used to preserve or clarify mixtures. The perfumer's skin darkened, their lungs weakened, their hands trembled. Yet they were revered as magicians, transforming decay into delight. Perfume, in that world, was not gentle. It was an act of domination, over nature, over time, and over the body itself. The language of perfume at Versailles, scent spoke as clearly as words. A man who smelled of sandalwood was ambitious of amber, powerful of lavender, pious. For women, the choice of perfume could whisper status or scandal. Madame de Montespan's fragrance was said to blend tuberose and vanilla, sensual and intoxicating. When she fell from grace, that same scent became taboo. Courtiers avoided it as though it carried contagion. Later, Madame de Pompadour preferred lighter floral scents, violet and iris, reflecting her image as an intellectual and refined mistress. By the time Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles, perfume had become almost a second language. She commissioned personal blends from the famed perfumer Louis XIV, a descendant of the Sun King's own. Her favorite was Perfume du Trianon, a soft mix of rose, jasmine, and sandalwood, the scent of innocence carefully crafted for public display. But as gossip darkened around her, her perfumes grew heavier, more complex, amber musk and violet, a fragrance of melancholy cloaked in sweetness. Even her downfall had a scent. The dangerous trade, the perfumers themselves lived curious double lives. They were part artisans, part alchemists, and part confidants of the powerful. In their shops, they heard the secrets of queens, the fears of mistresses, the confessions of courtiers. The profession demanded discretion. The right fragrance could make or ruin a reputation, and many nobles ordered perfumes under false names. But there was another, darker trade intertwined with theirs. The affaire des poisons, the infamous poison scandal of the 1670s. Several perfumers and apothecaries were implicated in the affair, accused of selling not only perfumes but also poisons and love potions. The most notorious among them, Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin, was both a perfumer and a poisoner to the aristocracy. From her shop, she sold powders and filters, sometimes perfumed, sometimes deadly. Her downfall exposed the dangerous overlap between beauty and death, between the perfumed bottle and the poisoned cup. When she was executed in 1680, it was said the air around the scaffold reeked of roses. The business of smell perfume, like powder, became an industry. By the 1700s, entire districts of Paris were devoted to it. The city of Grasse, in southern France, emerged as the heart of the trade. Its warm climate allowed for fields of jasmine, orange blossom, and roses. Its tanneries, once known for their foul smell, began producing perfumed gloves, transforming an unpleasant necessity into a fashionable luxury. From Grasse came the oils and essences that filled the shops of Versailles. The journey was long and expensive, but the profit was immense. A single vial of fine perfume could cost as much as a servant's annual wage. To possess such a bottle was to carry invisible wealth. It became common for nobles to exchange perfume as gifts, tokens of intimacy that could not be publicly read but privately understood. One vial might carry affection, another ambition. The bottle's scent spoke for the heart when words were dangerous. Perfume as escape for the women of Versailles. Perfume was more than adornment. It was a form of freedom. The scent they chose could redefine them, however briefly. A lonely duchess could smell like desire. An aging queen could breathe youth again through rosewater. Scent transcended rank, at least in imagination. It offered what reality could not, transformation without consequence, or so they believed. The irony was that even perfume had its poisons. The alcohols burned the skin, the animal ingredients carried disease, and the daily exposure often caused headaches and faintness. Still, no one at Versailles would have chosen to live without it. To be unscented was to be invisible, or worse, human. The philosophy of scent. As the Enlightenment dawned, philosophers too began to consider the power of smell. The writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau claimed that scent was the most immediate of all pleasures, the one closest to memory. Others called it the sense of the soul. To lose one's scent, they said, was to lose oneself. In a court obsessed with control, perfume became a paradox, a form of self-expression that everyone shared. It was personal yet universal, intimate yet political. And in that paradox, Versailles found its most seductive illusion that even decay could be made divine, if only it smelled like roses. But what happens when the perfumers begin to realize that their trade, their bottled paradise, hides the same corruption as the world it serves? When the very scents meant to disguise death begin to smell like it? That is where our next section begins. When one imagines Versailles, it is often the glitter that comes to mind: chandeliers, gold leaf, silks, mirrors. But in truth, the palace's most defining quality was invisible. It was the air itself. To survive in the court of the Sun King, one had to master it. Not the weather, but the atmosphere of odor, expectation, and artifice. Every corridor had a scent, every presence a trace. To smell was to know, to perfume was to control. This invisible world was ruled not by kings, but by perfumers. The perfumer's workshop, in the narrow streets of Paris and the sunlit hills of Grasse, Perfumers worked in rooms heavy with aroma and silence. Jars of powdered resin sat beside stills of copper. The stills hissed softly, distilling petals, leaves, and bark into oil. The perfumer's table was a geography of scent. The sharpness of citrus, the softness of jasmine, the animal warmth of civet. It was both chemistry and ritual. First came extraction, pressing or soaking raw materials in fat or alcohol to draw out their essence. Flowers like jasmine or tuberose, too delicate for heat, were placed on layers of fat in a process called enfleurage. The fat absorbed their perfume over several days before being scraped and washed with alcohol. Then came distillation, where heat transformed water and plants into fragrant vapor that cooled into essential oil. Each oil had its temperament, some strong, others fleeting. The perfumer learned to blend them as a musician balances notes, creating accords that pleased the royal nose. A failed blend could mean ruin. A perfect one could bring fortune, or even a title. The science of seduction. By the 18th century, scent had become a form of soft power. At court, a single whiff could change one's reputation. A duchess who wore too strong a musk was judged vulgar, too faint a violet, insipid. The right balance signaled taste, the great currency of the Enlightenment. To smell correct was to be civilized. Perfumers learned to manipulate this obsession. They designed fragrances that seemed effortless, as though beauty itself had no labor behind it. Perfume became a kind of diplomacy. An ambassador arriving from Spain might bring amber oils from Seville, one from England, lavender from Kent. When these foreign essences reached the king's court, they became part of the French identity, absorbed, refined, and renamed. It was olfactory imperialism, the conquest of the nose. The hidden ingredients few outside the perfumer's trade knew what truly went into these royal blends. Some of the most coveted ingredients were of animal origin, harvested through suffering. Civet, taken from the musk glands of an African civet cat, required the animal to be kept alive and scraped repeatedly for secretion. Castoreum, a leathery scent from the beaver, was extracted from sacs near its tail. Musk came from the glands of the Tibetan musk deer, hunted to near extinction. These materials gave perfumes their depth and longevity, a strange echo of mortality in the midst of beauty. Other ingredients were obtained through global trade. Ambergris, the waxy substance formed in the intestines of sperm whales, drifted onto beaches like treasure. Spices from India, cinnamon, clove, cardamom, were brought by ship at great cost. Florals came from France itself, grown in the fields of grass under the Provenal sun. Each bottle of perfume was, in truth, a map of empire, a distillation of global labor, colonial trade, and invisible suffering. The perfumer's hands mixed the world itself. The Queen's nose. When Marie Antoinette first arrived from Austria in 1770, she was only 14, a child wrapped in silks and expectations. Her first encounter with Versailles was not visual but olfactory. The air of the palace struck her, thick with tobacco, sweat and powder. She soon surrounded herself with scent as a form of armor. Her private perfumer, Louis XIV, created fragrances to match her moods. In letters, he described her preference for the freshness of gardens and milk. Her favorite perfume, Parfum du Trianon, was designed to evoke innocence: rose, jasmine, violet, sandalwood, and a faint touch of vanilla. It smelled of spring after rain, a deliberate contrast to the heavy, musky scents favored by older courtiers. Yet, as the years passed, her perfumes grew darker, more complex. Fargen wrote that she requested less flower, more shadow. To wear perfume for her was to write her own myth in the air. Perfume as disguise, but scent could conceal as well as reveal. At Versailles, secrets spread faster than perfume, and sometimes the two were intertwined. When Madame de Montespan fell from grace after the poison scandals, her signature perfume became her undoing. She had long worn a heady blend of tuberose and vanilla, unmistakable, intoxicating. After her association with Lavoisin and rumors of black masses, the same scent became a symbol of guilt. Courtiers whispered that they could smell her sin. Her perfume outlived her reputation. Such stories made perfumers cautious. They began selling anonymous blends, unmarked bottles for those who wished to hide. These silent perfumes had no floral signatures, only clean, faint notes meant to erase identity rather than announce it. For some, that was the greater luxury, to be unseen, unsmelled, unjudged. The poison and the perfume. The line between fragrance and poison was thinner than anyone admitted. Many of the same ingredients used in perfumes, resins, roots, animal extracts, appeared in medicinal and toxic recipes. A perfumer was expected to know not just what delighted the senses, but what could dull them. In the 1670s, when the affaire des poisons erupted, several perfumers and apothecaries were arrested. Among them was a woman named Marguerite de la Croix, accused of selling perfumes of death, mixtures of musk and arsenic meant to be worn or burned in rooms to kill discreetly. Though her guilt was never proven, the scandal tainted the trade for decades. Perfume's association with poison lingered like a ghost in the royal chambers. Every scent carried a question: was it pleasure or prelude to death? The invisible politics of smell. By the late 1700s, scent had become a political weapon. Royal perfumers began producing exclusive fragrances for the aristocracy, marking class through aroma. The wealthy smelled of complexity, blends requiring dozens of rare ingredients. The poor smelled of simplicity, soap, vinegar, smoke. To the urban nose, poverty had a scent, and so did privilege. Even revolutionaries noticed. In 1789, pamphlets mocked the Queen